Imagine if you forgot your friend's birthday. How would that feel for them or for you? Imagine if you forgot your wedding anniversary. How much worse would that be? But how bad would it be if you forgot who you were? Remember, do not forget. Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness, from the day that you departed from the land of Egypt until you came to this place. You have been rebellious against the Lord. That is quite a way to start. I mean, with that memory verse, to basically say, remember how you were rebellious, how you were bad, all these things, and why then is the lesson kind of starting out with that? Why is the title telling us not to forget? And why is it saying don't forget the bad things that you did? I mean, that question, right? Why remember rebellion? And so I want to think about that and talk about this specific focus in the lesson, because it's not entirely talking about remember bad things. It's more the way that we see history, right? How we look back and learn from those things and bring that into this context to understand how Israel, basically, they were now about to enter this promised land, and remembering everything they did was important. It was vital for one specific reason. I want to start with looking at Monday and basically what it was talking about there. Basically, the lesson is describing and showing, right, everything that God has done for Israel. It's showing how great they are. I mean, from being slaves, right, and each step pushing them further and further into this great nation. And now they're about to become that great nation. They're about to take over all this land, have all of this prosperity, right, and have God. Now, to put that into perspective, I mean, imagine you're there, right? You were nothing. It's a rags to riches story, where basically you started completely poor, not even having your own independence, and all of a sudden, now you're going here into this amazing place with wealth, looking to other nations, or other nations looking to you, and how is that going to affect you? This is what Israel is facing. They are now in a position of so much blessings, so much prosperity that it might affect them. And it has already in the wilderness. And it's affected them because they were rebelling. They were turning against what God wanted, because that was order, that was for their own benefit, right? I mean, just remembering how, small thing, their regulations, their laws and rules for how to eat meat, how to cleanse themselves, how to deal with being in contact with blood, all of that, right, made no sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense when you look at history and say, why are all these things saying? It's just a rule, right? Because how would God explain bacteria? How would God explain, look at your hands. Do you see anything? No, well, there are things that are so small you can't see that is going to kill you. You can't explain that to them, but God found a way to put it this way to them so they could understand it. And now, all of these things, right, they're still rebelling because they don't understand. Today, we have that context. We understand. And likewise for Israel, they don't have that context. They're living in this situational moment where for them, because they're in that situation, in that moment, they're not seeing this context that God can see, this perspective, that God knows what is better for them. And they're rebelling. But now they're going to have that much more privilege, benefit, whatever it is, and that is going to affect them. That is going to make them either strengthen themselves in God or not. And I want to focus on one thing. Tuesday was talking about basically how they could forget, right? This question of how could Israel forget everything that God did for them? Because think about it. They are they're walking through miracle after miracle with the pillar of cloud and fire, right? Through seas that are opening, even Jericho, all these amazing miracles. The fact that every single day food rains down from the sky and only lasts a day, but every day it's there for them. These are all crazy miracles, but they're becoming desensitized. How could they forget, right? How could this affect them to such a degree that they would just change? But that's the interesting thing, because we don't do anything drastically, spontaneously, all of a sudden. If you look at anything that we do, it's always so gradual that we don't realize how we've changed. I mean, just looking at me, if you go and scroll through all the thumbnails of my, basically just seeing my hair, I've gotten used to having my hair this long that I don't even realize how short it was, and I should be cutting it. But the fact that I've just every day lived with it, and everyone around me lived with seeing me have my hair grow, it's not odd to them. But if someone who hasn't seen me in a while sees me, I'm different, right? So likewise, the things that we do, it will change us slowly until we're not recognizable. So I wanted to read a quote that kind of emphasizes this a little bit, that God is noticing this and almost what he's telling them to do. And this is what the lesson says. It's not a coincidence that right after Moses tells them not to forget, not to let these things depart from your heart, he tells them to teach these things to the next generation and to the generation after. It's basically, how do we keep ourselves in a path that will remind us, that will keep us aware of what's happened? It's to teach the next generation, because if we change, and each time it changes, right, we forget, we neglect, the next generation will lose that context. They will lose that understanding. And now they will have to form their own opinions that revolves around what they were taught, and they won't know everything that God showed them. They're not going to understand what it was like to go through the desert. All they're going to have is all of these blessings that they're going to feel entitled to. And that is what you see in Israel, even in the desert already, and you see that happen when they inherit the land. They forget that they were slaves. They forget every blessing that God gave them, right? They just completely forget it. So that's one thing that is very vital that God is trying to show, and why this lesson is trying to touch on something important, right? To not forget, to remember, because it's not that it's a bad thing. It's a lesson to be learned of why they rebelled. What was the context? What was happening? Why didn't they understand? Because this allows them to realize and recognize, right? I mean, Moses, who had just sinned, the biggest, probably most monumental change to Israel at that moment was the fact that Moses was going to be leaving them as leader, as this representative to God, and they felt like they weren't going to have anyone. Would Joshua live up to what Moses did, right? But they were also recognizing something. The sin that Moses did was because it made the power that was supposed to be God, and that leadership that was supposed to be God's, it put it in, it made it seem like Moses was the one in charge. And the way he acted made it seem like he was in charge. And the punishment and what Moses had to do by not getting into the promised land was to show that God was the one in charge and not Moses, right? It was very severe because it would have made all of Israel think that it was always Moses and not God. And so these things serve as a lesson. They were there. They realized and recognized the mistake that they made. They were complaining, but they realized they were always thinking that it was toward Moses when it was actually toward God, and that made it that much more serious, right? So these things, when we look back, we understand that context. It gives us perspective. But imagine if you lose half of that. You're not going to understand. So this is the tough part of all of this, right? Them going from being slaves to basically ruling and being so favored by God that they could basically do anything in their minds. They were invincible, right? If God could just make their enemies run away, it can get to your head. That is why this humility is very hard when you understand this context. And I wanted to focus on one interesting thing to conclude and focus on Friday's lesson, because this was, it was very, the way it portrayed it was really nice. Because let's think about the flood. The lesson has a quote that talks about the rainbow, right? And if we think about, put ourselves into a certain context, the flood happened that destroyed everyone. How scary, how devastating, right, would that be? Now, the survivors, God brings out a rainbow and says, this is my sign, right, for you to remember. It's, I forget what they called it, but basically that is what God put as a reminder, right? For everyone after that to remember that he promised that he would not do that again. He would not destroy the world with a flood. Now imagine, because remember, before that, they had not experienced this before. So now imagine the first time they saw a storm come again and all that rain. They must have been terrified. But then the rainbow came out, and that was a strengthened reminder for them. Oh yeah, God wouldn't do that. Even though it felt like it was not going to happen. So they had that context. But eventually you get used to storms and rain and all that happening continuously, so you're fine with it. And then you start forgetting. But that rainbow, because it was there, it always had that reminder. Because what it says here, and I want to read this quote that explains a little bit deeper what the rainbow was doing. It was God's purpose that as the children of after generations should ask the meaning of the glorious arch which spans the heavens, their parents should repeat the story of the flood and tell them that the Most High had bended the bow and placed it in the clouds as an assurance that the water should never again overflow the earth. So this is a lesson that now if someone asks, right, this question, why is that there? We could serve that as an opportunity to tell the next generation, tell our children, this is what God did. This is what happened. Here's the story and the context. And that is the reminder, which could serve for them to remember, right? The rebellion, all those things, and why God had to do it. And likewise here, Israel is having countless stories like that, things that they can look back if they remember why and understand why they rebelled. And so, remember, it's very easy for us to be in the middle of it and think that we're right and understand things because it feels that way. It feels right when you see what Israel is saying. It's absurd, but to them it feels right when you understand the context of the time, when you understand what's going on around them. It's just obvious. It makes sense for them. Like if we talk, like I said earlier, about diseases and bacteria, the way that people would deal with that. I mean, every little nuance of what people did, right? Wearing perfume. Perfume was made so you would get rid of the bad smells. That wasn't resolving the problem, right? It was covering it up. We understand that today. Back then, it made sense because, if you don't smell the problem, then the problem must have gone away. So with context, we understand now. But if you look and understand the context that they had, it serves as a lesson for us today. So I want you to think about that with every decision that you're making. Look back, understand the context and where things came from. Look at the Bible and see its context to grasp the knowledge that it's trying to give you so you can better figure out what you should be doing and what path you should be going toward. So look at that and think, are you doing things because you feel like it, or are you understanding and trying to get this bigger picture so God can guide you and help you?